I want to welcome everyone. I want to welcome everyone on behalf of the Department of African and Afro-American Studies at Duke University to what promises to be a generative and remarkable talk and discussion with Dr. Moya Bailey. My name is
remarkable. That's a little, that's some pressure.
Without a doubt. My name is Joseph Winters. I'm a professor here at Duke University in Religious Studies and African Studies. I am a co-organizer of this lecture, which is part of a year-long lecture series. The other co-organizer is Amaria Mukuru, who is also a professor of African and African Studies, as well as cultural anthropology. Before I introduce our speaker, Dr. Moya Bailey, I want to thank the Department of African and African Studies, particularly Tyra Dixon, with all of her work, her tireless effort to organize this lecture in this series. So I am honored to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Moya Bailey, who is an assistant professor of Africana Studies and the program of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Northeastern University. Her work focuses on marginalized groups' use of digital media to promote social justice as acts of self-affirmation and health promotion. And she's interested in how race, gender, and sexuality are represented in media and medicine. Bailey currently curates the Transformed H Tumblr Initiative in Digital Humanities. She's also the digital alchemist for the Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network. She is currently an MLK Martin Luther King Visiting Scholar at MIT for the 2021 academic year. Her first book will be coming out in May. It's titled Misogynoir Transformed, Black Woman's Digital Resistance. Can't wait to read that. And on a personal note, as I told her earlier, I read her 2013 essay, Homo Latent Masculinity and Hip Hop Culture. I read that every time I teach my hip hop course, and it's always one of the kind of favorite essays and generates the most discussion. So the talk today will be from did I say that right? To Uloy, the future of queer Black genders. Thank you, Professor Dr. Bailey.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And it is a real pleasure. I am just going to try and share my screen and make sure we are good to go. All right, can everyone see this and hear this? Well, you can't hear anything yet, but can I get a thumbs up in the chat? Oh, great, perfect. So the title has shifted just a little bit, to Uloy, Queer Black Genders at the End of the Anthropocene. But again, I wanna thank Dr. Winters for the invitation to join you all. And I also want to thank Tyra Dixon for all of her logistical help in making this event possible. I am joining you all virtually from land that is traditionally stewarded by the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, and Pawtucket, also known as Boston, Massachusetts. I was really moved by a non-land acknowledgement in which Indigenous elders made clear that land acknowledgements themselves are not enough and that they can actually help white supremacy to relax. So I don't want to help white supremacy relax, but I do think when it comes to this turn to the digital in these pandemic times, it can be easy to forget that there is hardware that runs all over Turtle Island that connects us to our digital devices, and that this hardware is made from minerals extracted from stolen land and mined by exploited people around the world. And similarly, I do think when it comes to gender, we can forget that gender has been and remains mutable, or that the story we know of gender is not the only one. The Wampanoag had a matrilineal society in which women contributed to their communities by providing 75% of the food that these communities ate. Women were traders, leaders of their communities, and would sometimes take wives as well as assume the social roles of men given their survival prowess. gender and gender roles are not always already correlated. So in today's talk, I am extending this line of thinking into our post-Anthropocene futures. In what ways are we already reimagining gender beyond a binary? And in what ways are we reinvesting in gender tropes that lack a liberatory ethos? Does it even matter? In the humanist tradition of which I and this talk are wrought, I am asking questions to which I don't necessarily have answers. That said, these questions are definitely not rhetorical. They are very much questions I want to think about together with you. And this is, as I said, a new thing I'm thinking about. So I really hope that in Q&A, in the chat with questions, that we can think about this together. And in that spirit of thinking about this together, I am wanting to invite you to use the chat and the Q&A to ask questions, as well as Twitter. And that's my Twitter handle there, MoyaZB. Alliteration is my favorite literary device, with assonance a close second, hence the talk title. I am also trying to think about Blackness and its boundaries when we begin to think beyond the human. Energized by Zakiya Iman Jackson's Becoming Human, I'm thinking about the limits of humanity and where Black people do and don't fit into that category, and whether we even want to. I draw on the work of acclaimed Afrofuturist author Octavia Butler to consider what is possible beyond the human for Black genders, and whether the category of human, gender, or even Blackness are identities to which we want to remain loyal. While there is a proverbial we, one that I think might extend to the people who are listening to this talk, that knows toxic masculinity, knows no gender, I find that when we critique gender tropes, this is something that's fallen out of favor. Perhaps due to our well-deserved skepticism of respectability, misogynist behaviors can go un- and under-addressed for fear of being read as conservative pearl clutchers that limit others' expression. Additionally, with our attention trained so steadily on toxic masculinity, we miss the ways that masculinity can reinforce restrictive ideas about gender. And while toxic femininity has rightfully been dismissed as a men's rights Trojan horse of false equivalency, where is the room to talk about femininity that does or doesn't get us closer to liberation? With the ubiquity of misogyny and misogynoir, is there even a safe space, time to talk about what is not serving us within femininity? I turn, as I often do, to Octavia Butler for the beginnings of some answers, which of course raises more questions, which is all to say, please follow me down the rabbit hole and let's see where we end up. Black lesbian rapper Young M.A. dominated the airwaves in the summer of 2016 with the Brooklyn and liquor suffused lyrics of Ooh. The video features the artist hanging with her boys, eating Chinese takeout, drinking Henny, playing video games, and of course, women, guns, and money. While this video and its lyrics have all the trappings of any rap video, it's what Young M.A. says at the top of her Genius interview about them that made this content of interest to me in our Afrofutures.
Ooh, when I said ooh, it was just another way of being free. Like, I'm gonna just call it ooh, fuck it. Like, it was more of those records, like, I'm not gonna put too much on it. I'm just gonna do whatever and see how people take to it. It was just something me and my bros that say, like, ooh.
When I said, ooh, it's just another way of being free. It's just something me and my bros say. This vocal flourish, not to put too much on it, gives the song a futuristic callback, one that young M.A. recognized as a potentially potent pull that she wanted to, quote, see how people took to it. Ooh is an auditory opulence that feels good in your mouth and on your ears. In the grand tradition of Black breath and sound, I would say see the work of Ashawn Crawley. Ooh delights with its whimsy, even as the accompanying lyrics dismay, with their adherence to very strict ideas about masculinity and femininity. Young M.A. raps.
I don't open doors for no horse. I just want the neck, nothing more. Shorty, make it clap, make it applaud. When you tired of your man, give me a call.
These bars follow the oft-quoted misogynistic line, you call her Stephanie, I call her Heffany. That young M.A. speaks so candidly about her relationships with women is a welcome shift in a hip-hop landscape that actively disavows queerness, but her rhymes remain disappointingly steeped in the same misogynoir that we hear in rap lyrics penned by cishet men. The freedom that uttering ooh provides for M.A. and her boys is not extended to the more feminine women around her. Femininity seems to foreclose the possibility of being a speaking subject in the world's young M.A.'s words craft. Ooh's success was unprecedented, charting for 23 weeks and landing the rapper an opening spot on Beyonce's Formation tour stop in New Jersey. The infectious earworm gave the self-professed dyke and other queer women a visibility in hip-hop they had not known before. Missy, Queen Latifah, Da Brat, MC Lyte notwithstanding. An out-masculine lesbian rapper was a stark contrast from the socially acceptable representations of feminine rappers who used girl-on-girl imagery as a way to signal freakiness for a male gaze. Young M.A. is one of the boys, and as such, she does the gazing as well. In fact, she is even in a position to subvert the heterosexual gaze that wishes to render her sex with women as prurient spectacle. M.A. refuses to explain lesbian sex, saying in her Genius interview,
I mean, I understand, guys that don't understand because they're not a dyke. You understand what I'm saying? But all the dykes out there know exactly what I'm talking about. It ain't for a guy to understand. If you don't understand, he don't gotta understand it.
Young M.A. protects queer business, even as she dismisses the partners who participate in it. So on the one hand, M.A. bucks a trend that would have all the secrets of sub-communities laid bare on social media, even as she enforces harmful stereotypes about her more feminine counterparts. How does this performance of masculinity over and against femininity lead to liberation if women and more feminine people are not portrayed as agential in constructing that vision? As I explained in the introduction of my forthcoming book, Misogynoir Transformed: Black Women's Digital Resistance, available for pre-order at your favorite independent bookstore, a long practiced stigma management strategy by those multiply marginalized is to deflect negativity away from themselves by admonishing others. In crafting legible female masculinity, Black lesbian celebrities like Young M.A. or Lena Waithe employ the same bros before hoes, or as M.A. says in Ooh, a bro code mentality that is rampant among cishet men. Through writing the denigrating character of Peaches in comedian Billy Sorrell's viral video, Shit Black Girls Say, and her initial reluctance to address the sexual harassment of 2 Black women on her Showtime vehicle, The Shy, Lena Waithe, like Young M.A., cast her lot with the boys. This defensive and toxic masculinity has also been discussed as protest hypermasculinity by scholar Laura Lane Steele. She reads the misogynoir enacted through toxic masculinity by masculine of center women as a means to escape the generally lower social position of Black lesbians in a heteropatriarchal society. Young M.A., Waithe, and singer Syd take on a bro persona, effectively distancing themselves from the misogynoir that would otherwise be sent in their direction. This assertion is not meant to imply that the masculinity that these queer women wield is any more performative than anyone else's, but it is to say that masculinity in a patriarchal world means protection, a protection that actively excludes more feminine women. As I wrote in my piece, Homo Latent Masculinity in Hip Hop Culture, Syd of the Afrofuturist hip hop groups Odd Future and the Internet has successfully deflected attention away from her gender by reinforcing a gender binary and hierarchy that she's able to benefit from as a more masculine presenting woman. In a 2011 MTV News interview with the group, Syd recounts a conversation with her father about being the only cis woman in the group.
When I first started really Odd Future heavy, my dad was like, really, they talk about some crazy shit, and you're, as a female, you're slapping a lot of other females in the face. I'm like, that's what I do, I slap bitches.
She and her Odd Future bandmates dissolve into laughter. Her words prove that she is one of the boys and not one of the girls because she slaps bitches and does not get slapped. Whether this violence is real or figurative is not the point, as her laughter and the laughter of her bandmates solidify their bond. Her belonging is connected to her gender presentation, which is aligned with her friends through a masculinity that is antagonistic to women. She is not the hypothetical woman getting slapped. Laughing at and potentially hitting women makes Syd one of the boys, which supports her position in the group. I'm reminded of Syd's commentary when I think of Lena Waithe's role in making Shit Black Girls Say a viral success and Young M.A.'s ubiquitous dismissal of the women she fucks. By distancing themselves from Black women, by making other Black women the punchline of their jokes and lyrics, Syd, Waithe, and Young M.A. are able to move in the world with the slight advantage their masculinity affords, sparing them the deadly consequences that befell their masculine of center sister, Zakiya Gunn. But part of shoring up that masculinity requires the sacrifice of fellow Black women. The internalized misogynoir of these queer women is expressed through their denigration of their more feminine peers. Young M.A.'s vision of masculinity was not that different from the masculinity that already exists within cishet men's spaces, nor is the femininity of her projected paramours all that different from that of women who date her boys. In fact, like the cis dudes around her, part of her appeal is her ability to pull ostensibly straight cis women, beating cishet men at their own game. That these bad bitches are understood as straight is part of making the point of M.A.'s prowess. You'll notice that I did not call these women femmes, as they are not self-identified queer women. As anthropologist Savannah Shangay offers in the Black Feminist Futures hosted panel on gender and femme is a volitional space, one that you opt into and cannot be assigned by someone else. While we have begun to talk about femme as a potentially critical reclaiming of femininity, we have not made as many demands of queer masculinities to exist outside of a problematic or even a default masculinity. In imagining a gender liberatory future as the end of the Anthropocene is upon us, I turn to science fiction, particularly the work of Octavia Butler in her Lilith Brood series, to explore our human notions of gender by introducing an alien species with three. Butler, I believe, can help us get back to the promised freedom of ooh, and perhaps extend it beyond the soul liberation of masculine people. In this short clip from the Octavia Butler TED Ed video I made with the founder of the Octavia Butler Legacy Network, Ayanna Jameson, we described the plot to Dawn, the 1987 book that launched the Exogenesis series, now known as Lilith's Brood.
Following a devastating nuclear war, Lilith Iyapo awakens after 250 years of stasis to find herself surrounded by a group of aliens called the Oankali. These highly evolved beings want to trade DNA by breeding with humans so that each species' genes can diversify and fortify the other. The only alternative they offer is sterilization of the entire human race. Should humanity take the leap into the biological unknown, or hold on to its identity and perish? Questions like this haunt Octavia Butler's Dawn, the first in her trilogy, Lilith's Brood.
Lilith Iyapo learns that her alien overlords are known as the Oankali, and unlike humans, have three fully integrated sexes in their species. Of the many decidedly different dimensions of Oankali existence, one of my favorite facts is that the male, female, and Uloi are all essential beings in their reproduction and pleasure. Sex for the Oankali is a polyfidelitous pleasure fest every time, one to which they invite other species they have partnered with to participate in, most notably humans. But
I think we're having some technical difficulties. I just sent her a note. And there she is.
oops. Can you tell me when I dropped out?
When you got to the exciting part.
Yeah.
You were just about to tell us about human alien sex, I think.
Oh yes. Okay. I can go back there. I apologize. Okay. Human alien sex. Here we go. Sex for the Oankali is a polyfidelitous pleasure fest every time, one to which they invite other species they have partnered with to participate in, most notably humans. But it is the Uloi who do the work of bringing these beings together. The Uloi is the ultimate gatherer and gene trader, sussing out the most interesting genetic material in each of its mated partners. Lest this genetic trading be read only as an ableist eugenic enterprise, one of the reasons Uloi are so interested in humans is the way that cancer transforms the body and could potentially transform their species. The Oankali's relational practices with other species raise real questions about assimilation and colonization, given how they can be manipulative in their curious pursuits of genetic material. What Butler offers in these three texts through the Oankali is a call to question what humans find attractive and what qualities and characteristics get attributed to genetic sex. To take it back to the top of the talk, in Butler's worlds, gender and gender role are not necessarily correlated, but more importantly, gender and sex are less about the body and more about the social role these gender sexes perform in their communities. I have the distinct privilege of being the second person to see Octavia Butler's papers in the Huntington Library. The collection is 386 boxes of material, of which I got through about 25. The images that follow are from the collection, but were not taken by me. They provide a glimpse into Butler's process and thinking about her alien species and the potential for a gender freedom that Young M.A. can only allude to and limits to only one gender expression in her lyrics. So as Butler's notes note, the Oankali have three genders, and those genders all have different social roles to play in their society. Butler writes very plainly, and you can see the highlighted bits here. Butler writes, males are problem solvers. Females are creators and builders. And an Uloi is a gene trader. It brings people together, settles their disputes, and joins species biologically. So one really exciting bit about getting to look at Octavia's papers is just seeing how much she thought about the kind of work that she did to uncover who her protagonists are, where they come from, and how they understand themselves. And these Oankali characteristics are such an exciting and different, a bit of a departure from how we think about humans, right? So this vast and terrible patience, that is definitely not something I think of or associate with humans. Rock firm family units that are not casually created and only dissolved in death. And again, the Uloi have this intense seductive sexuality that also includes an apprenticeship model of older Uloi teaching younger Uloi how to do this work of giving pleasure and also doing this important genetic trading that keeps their society moving forward. And again, a radical honesty, this unfailing honesty, even to the point of bluntness, which is very different to what we imagine in our world. So if they're not going to speak the truth, then they would rather be silent. And of course, Oankali also have this bit of manipulation that leads to other questions that are beyond the scope of this talk, which might include a conversation about consent. And I know other people have really taken up consent in Octavia Butler's work, and particularly in this series. These sex gender descriptions do address relative anatomical differences, but at the heart of these descriptions is the role that these entities play in society. Maleness, femaleness, being Uloi are as much about what you do as it is about what your physical body can do. In fact, this attention to social role has the potential to address some of the ableism embedded in human ideas about gender. If being a male is about solving problems, that's got little to do with physiology and more to do with how you show up when there's an issue at hand. Butler provides a window into another way of imagining gender that, in my reading of the text, is not shored up by how one relates to other members of the same sex, nor to the other sexes. Your sex is about what you do, not who you do, or even how you look while doing it. A freedom to be as you are in a capacity that helps your polyfidelitous family while eschewing the pressure to perform your gender or sex for an imagined audience is evident in each page and passage of Butler's books. I want to note the different ways that Butler talks about the males and females of the species when compared to the ooloi. The ooloi is described using a singular verb conjugation, while males and females are not. The ooloi is alone, but definitely not lonely, singular, but not single, as the literal crucible through which the genetic forging of life occurs. The ooloi incorporates elements of both the male and female of its species, problem-solving potential genetic issues, while creating and building new pathways to existence among the Oankali. Every being within the Oankali community is different because the gene trading that occurs in each act of reproduction is unique. The Oankali all look different and continue to morph and shift given the new genetic material ooloi have access to. And this is actually a sketch that Butler drew of what she imagined an ooloi would look like. So you can see that the way she understands these appendages is that it creates more of a mask effect than a sense of hairiness. And these tendrils can come together and be darker or unbroken flesh, or they can wave free, clutch objects. And if you're interested, I highly suggest just doing a Google search for images of ooloi, because a lot of people have created their own interpretations of what they imagine the ooloi to look like. Butler's sketch tries to capture some of the nuances in appearance, and in so doing, what are some of the ways that our current perceptions of what is and isn't attractive are connected to our beliefs about gender? And this is where I also want to begin the loop back to the top of the talk, and where I have more questions than answers. Kai Green, also a part of the Black Feminist Futures panel I mentioned before, reminds us that we actually really like gender as humans, that we are invested in it, and we actually revel in it. Gender expression often drives attraction. It's codified in the language we use on dating apps. And here I'm thinking of the language of mask for mask, or stud for stud, femme for femme, etc. Relatedly, Young M.A.'s casual misogynoir is a feature, not a bug, of her gender appeal. As hip-hop feminist Joan Morgan put it, how come no one ever admits that part of the reason women love hip-hop, as sexist as it is because all that in-your-face testosterone makes our nipples hard. While testosterone here has been coded as masculine, the point remains that part of the way gender gets taken up is through our investment in gender presentation that maps on to socially acceptable gender expressions, even in queer spaces. And so here I'm starting to think about, what is it about these gender ideas that shape our desire, and how do we know what is our desire and what hasn't been part of our conditioning in the world in which we occupy? So how might we use Butler and other sci-fi writers work to imagine new possibilities of gender and sex that push us beyond our comfort zones. What might a liberatory gender scene look like at the end of the world? I was joking with a friend that humanity is going the way of the dinosaurs, and that I don't want to go into that good night with the limited expression of what gender can be based on societal norms and expectations I didn't create or consent to. How do we rewrite the language of gender, even as there are parts that we are drawn to, and how do we make space for the world we want? How are we living into the freedom of sound and breath that is the potential of ooh and the possibility of ooh boy? What gender sex magic can we dream up if given the chance? And so before I open it up to questions, I'd like to take a moment for us to imagine together. I'm going to play the following video, and I just ask that as you listen to the music, how might you dream of a new gender sex magic at the end of the world? And if you're open to it, I'd love to hear what you've been imagining and what you feel like would actually make this world different. And what I'll be playing is a song from the EP of Duran Bernard, a queer and up and coming artist who I really enjoy. And lest we think that our future sex possibilities are only in the very sapphic tradition of polyfidelity, etc., Duran Bernard is asking us to think about how we can be radically honest in stating what it is that we need and what we don't want out of a sexual encounter. So again, as you listen, please dream of what you might want in a different way of expressing gender and sexuality.
Don't you get stuck in love with me. Ooh, yeah. Don't you get stuck in love with me. Ooh, yeah. Please don't let the sun come up and you ain't up there, gotta love. You be in your corner, being whatever you wanna, but you can't be that with me. I stay being tardy, showing up late to the party, but the jam is guaranteed. I have no capacity for responsibility. Still on a journey to discover who I'm coming to be. Don't you get stuck in love with me. Don't you get stuck. Don't you get stuck in love. Oh yeah. Don't you let the sun come up and you ain't up and gotta love. get stuck. Ooh.
Thanks so much.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Professor Bailey. So I think what we will, Professor Makudu and myself will ask some questions, do a kind of question and answer, and then kind of go to the chat after that, if that makes sense. Professor Makudu, did you want to ask the first question?
Oh, sure, why not? So I actually have 3 questions, and they come from a place of being mostly, let me be very honest, quite ignorant. So, but I wondered about the 3 following things, and maybe just open something up. Tommy DeFrance has a fabulous question in the Q&A, so that might be a best place to start. But so one was, what is the status of the Anthropocene for you in this argument? So by the end of the talk, you're speaking about the end of the world, and I'm not sure if the end of the world and the Anthropocene are the same thing. And whether for you, the Anthropocene is in fact a moment in which people are concerned about the end of the world as something that has to do with the sort of material degradation, deterioration of the world as a physical thing, or whether it's also something else. So that's the first question. The second question, and this was when you were talking about young MA, and you'll have to forgive me for this, but I had to ask the question whether the structural diagonally or orthogonally related figure is the Karen. In other words, across race in terms of whiteness and gender, that there is a sense in which the Karen figure, right, is a figure who is invested in patriarchy and misogyny, also for reasons of creating a space for themselves or self-protection or something of that sort. So that was another question. And the last question I actually had was about, what do you think is the status of the coming out narrative, given this talk? Because it feels to me as if, at least in certain spaces, the coming out narrative has actually disappeared. And I was also thinking about that in relationship to young MA, if in fact, part of what's going on there is a leaving behind, as you put it, of queerness, while holding on to toxic masculinity. So those are my three questions. And I have a lot more, but maybe let's start there.
Sure. So to take your first question, I think for a lot of humans, the end of the Anthropocene is seen as the end of the world. Like the shift to thinking about us as no longer central to how we understand what is happening, what is possible, feels like in its own apocalypse. And one of the reasons I really like Octavia Butler's work is she questions whether that is true or not, even as she questions whether humanity should survive. So part of her call in all of her work, as I read it, is a questioning of what about humanity should we keep and what do we perhaps need to get rid of? And she keeps coming back to these questions of hierarchies, whether they're along the axes of race, gender, sexuality, ability. She's always trying to get us to think about why humans really are so invested in hierarchy, and is that necessarily a good thing for us. And part of the way she gets us to think about that more deeply is to put humans in a space where they are no longer at the top of the hierarchy, and that even the hierarchies within humans that attempt to remain get subverted. So there's some interesting parts in this work about, white men who are encountering the Oankali and the Uloi, who are really struggling with their ideas about their own masculinity in the face of these alien species, and their inability to quote unquote protect their women, to protect human women from what is potentially could be a very pleasurable experience, but it's not something that they're in control of. And so that lack of control brings about all of these other questions. So that's kind of what I'm thinking in relationship to the first question. And then I'm going to skip to the second question, or the third question about coming out. I do think that the coming out narrative still exists, but I think it looks different depending on where you're located. I just actually had a friend tell me that the parents found out that one of the kids in a particular pod had come out to the friends as bisexual, but none of the young people said anything. It was the parents of the kid who came out who let the other parents know. And the kids were rather, they didn't think it was a big deal. So they felt no need to comment. So it was a conversation they were having amongst themselves. And so in that sense, I think the coming out narrative looks different, but there's still so many pockets where homophobia is alive and well, both here in the US and abroad. So I think on one level, there's a way that class perhaps obfuscates some of the ways that we see who's experiencing these coming out narratives and who isn't. Young M.A. also talks about her own narrative, and I think part of her story is being very brazen about her sexuality after having to hide it and keeping it from her family when she was younger. So there is, I think, that reactionary piece of coming out, which, that moment where you've got all your rainbow flags and everything that I do think is very much still a part of the narrative for some people. And yeah, thinking about Karens are really interesting because I don't know I do think that Karens do get some imagined protection by insisting on the role of white supremacy in their life, like that adherence to that seems to be imagined as a way of staying, connected to the world connected to a world in which they are protected. But unfortunately, I think we have too many examples of that actually not working out, that there is a lot of violence that, even white women experience that doesn't actually support the perhaps underlying thesis of the Karen's attachment to white supremacy. So I would suggest similarly that there is perhaps not I would say that to me, it does seem though that the protection of a masculinity that aligns with the boys that are in your crew does seem to have, in my, limited read of things, does seem to have a little bit more pull or weight than it does for Karens who are trying to operationalize white supremacy in that way.
So I do have a question, Dr. Bailey. First of all, thank you again. This was an amazing talk. So my question is, I mean, and I'm thinking about, right, this lecture. I'm thinking about your essay on homo latency, right? Like this turn to, I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about not only like, how you're seeing speculative fiction, right, and the kind of possibilities it can open up for, right, thinking about, right, genders, thinking about race, thinking about sexuality differently, but also maybe even the disappearance of the human, but also maybe think about what are the limitations also of speculative fiction or Octavia Butler's. I'm thinking about this in terms of, right, the debates about even thinking of future, right? So even if it's an odd future, even if it's a queer future, there might be something about future structurally that makes one invested in something like order, which means some kind of disciplining. So even if we can imagine multiple, right, multiple genders, there still might be something like an order emerging there, right, that has to either discipline or exclude certain desires, beings, and so forth. But I also wonder if there's something about Octavia Butler that already kind of understands that. That's why that the utopia is always a dystopia. So I'm just wondering if we could maybe just talk a little bit more about those limitations and possibilities in speculative fiction.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about the work of Grace Lee Boggs in this capacity. So I'm making us think through where our radical imaginations can go. So even our ideas of what a radical future can be are limited by our understandings of the present. So, people have been reinvigorated by Parable of the Sower at this time because Octavia Butler so accurately described the world that we are living in now, down to the fires in California. But that was because she was looking at the reality that she was in at the time. So it's not just that our futures are require an order, they're also very much invested and built from our understanding of the present. So I think if our radical imaginations are not allowed to go far and wide, then I do think that the things that we dream up can end up having these problems, which is why for Octavia's work and people inspired by her, there's this tendency to think less about what is the space, but what is the process related to the space. It's not a destination, but what emerges, what are the tools and strategies, processes we need to develop, practices that will help us whatever situation we find ourselves in. And so that's why I'm really inspired by the work of, Adrienne Marie Brown and Emergent Strategy, really asking us to think through what can we dream that isn't just a fixed point in space, but is about the process and tools, strategies that we use to get there.
So I have one other question, and again, I'm not entirely familiar with all this literature, but I'm just wondering, what is the status of the decolonial in your work? And given that you're inspired by someone like Butler, what's that conversation?
Yes, it's interesting because I do think her work asks us to consider just how humans are prone to want to be colonizers. And I think the second book, Parable of the Talents, really pushes us to think differently about who is the leader of the movement that we imagine as very progressive and opening up something else, but how that can quickly descend into something that is cultish, something that can be its own form of colonization, you know, that take root in the stars is not necessarily something that is consensual in terms of other species in the world or in the universe deciding whether or not they want to interact with humans in that way. And of course, what she does so brilliantly is gets us to think, well, okay, so we've had this moment of where we've imagined humans at the top of the food chain, but what happens when we're not? And then a different realization about how colonization feels, how our understandings of even superiority among species that have more control than humans. And this, of course, makes me think of Bloodchild and her work there, imagining what happens in human relationships with species where they're not in the dominant position. So I do think Butler is critical of, is always asking us to think further and even to think about our heroes and the people we imagine as having a certain ethos that, you know, we can't always be certain, and that we should always be, I don't know if suspicion is the right word, but we should always be hesitant, careful, curious about who accrues power and our own relationship to power.
I have one more question, then we'll go to the chat because I know a lot of people have some questions. Question, you started with thinking about alliteration, right? And the importance of alliteration for you. So I was thinking of, so like oo or uloi. I was thinking about kind of the way in which, you know, certainly within kind of hip hop studies, I don't want to say there's been a term, but there's kind of a heightened attention to the ways in which studies of hip hop have focused a lot on kind of hermeneutics and like meaning and not enough on sound, right? So you got a lot, right? Ethnomusicologists, I mean, yourself, but I'm thinking, I'm just thinking particularly of ethnomusicologists. I'm thinking of people like, you know, Justin Burton, Adrian Brown, like people, not all ethnomusicologists, but people who are thinking about the sonic dimensions, right? So you're talking about alliteration. I'm wondering, is there something about, right, a kind of emphasis, you know, emphasizing sound, emphasizing the sonic, thinking of auto-tune, right? I'm even thinking of going back to thinking about all the 70s soul artists who, you know, sang in falsetto. I'm just thinking, can you say a little bit more about that, about, you know, voice, sound, you know, tone and so forth, and how that might, you know, disrupt certain kind of gender binaries and rigid conceptions of gender? If so,
Yeah.
or maybe I'm too optimistic.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes me think about how a high falsetto voice within Black music spaces doesn't automatically code one as queer, and that there's a lot of room there for play. And if we think too about dress, and I know, you know, Mark Anthony Neal has talked about this as well, you know, there is room for some play and expansiveness in gender presentation, in clothing, in sound, but it has to be connected to certain things, right? Like it has to be in socially acceptable places. And it's when it's not in the place it's expected to be that it becomes a problem, or that it can become a problem. So I'm always curious about how we listen and how we imagine our connection to the beat and the automatic affirmative. And this is something I remember, like from my college days. Saul Williams came to campus and was talking about like the automatic affirmative of hip hop, and that the head nod is something that has you nodding along and agreeing to things that you may not agree with. So just again, sonically, there's so much that I love about ooh, which is why I've said it several times, and I always like to say it the way that she says it, because it feels good to say it. Even as some of the lyrics, don't, to me, get us closer to the world we want. And that tension is something that I think we've been thinking through as music scholars or people interested in music as a form for a long time.
Okay, so we have some really fabulous questions from the floor. And the first one is from Tommy DeFrance. And he says, can you speak to fabulation or fantasy or art making in relationship to Black lives lived in relation to media? For example, how does being in relationship to young MA as a young queer trans person of color in the world arrive as a roadmap to behavior, or to what degree might it be fantastical world making that exists as its own end? How are you thinking that fantasy through gender arrives in relationship to popular media? Could young MA already be a magical being of a gender that is a fabulation? And if not, why not?
Well, great question. So I mentioned Savannah Shangai's work before, and one of her articles is about an experience she had while teaching, where she had a young masculine of center student who was also potentially interested in another more feminine student, not yet queer, not yet femme-identified, etc. And realizing that part of their tension was evolved around the scripts that they had for themselves about how they were supposed to behave with each other, that there were expectations of how they should perform gender, of how they should interact, that ended up creating a narrative that became explosive, because for the student who was not yet queer, not yet femme, there was a desire there that got perhaps hurt by seeing this other student talk to another girl. And like, for me, all of that sounds, very much like teens in love, very familiar, but there's a narrative that was being enacted about how they should perform in their particular gender roles in relationship to that experience. So I am curious about what we can imagine that exists beyond that. And for me, young MA more fits the mold than disrupts it. And one way I think this is true is young MA was celebrated for, I guess, directing a short, I don't know if it was short, of directing a pornographic film that ended up on Pornhub. And in directing it, one of the critiques was that it still was very much like very feminine women performing in ways that matched a sanitized and very much male gaze in relationship to porn. So it wasn't an opening up of what queer possibilities could be in sexuality. It very much aligned itself with what we already know. So I would hope that there are possibilities within sci-fi and other dimensions of work and artistry that could maybe take young M.A. out of those pretty prescribed roles that it seems she exists in. Perhaps there is a collaboration between young M.A. and Janelle Monáe that opens up something else. Who knows? But I do think that another piece of this too is collaboration. Perhaps there is more possible when we join forces and move beyond our own expectations.
That's great. The next question comes from, I apologize if I pronounce the name wrong, George Moife. At certain points during the Zoom, parts of the Bernard performance were obscured by some glitch. It made me think about our overemphasis of visuality when it comes to rendering one's gender as seeable. At the same time, I was struck by how I did not need video to hear the violence embedded in young M.A.'s and Sid the Kid's expressions of masculinity. How do visuality and aurality compare and contrast in the construction of gender? To put a finer point on the question, why is it so hard for others to see the range of Black genders? In your work, do you see the varieties of our gender expressions and reinstantiation of patriarchal concepts invisibilized in mainstream gender analyses?
Oh, such a great question. I definitely do. I think that there is a range of gender expression, and both at the sonic and visual level, that gets obscured and that we don't think about enough in what we imagine as representation for ourselves. So part of what I talk about in the book, I have a chapter on queer web shows, particularly queer web shows that center people assigned female at birth, and what those shows are trying to encapsulate, show, have us hear about Black queer women's and women adjacent folks' experience in the context of the cities where they live. And something that comes up in those spaces are the ways gender expression gets policed even within groups, that there's an expectation of what is possible, who is allowed to be with whom, what types of relationship formations are considered viable or desirable, even within communities that are already marginalized, that I think doesn't lend to the diversity of how people are living. I do see another space, which I think also relates to the first question. I do see the way that people are using fan fiction as a radical opening of more possibilities when it comes to gender, sexuality, and ways of human relation. So some of the things that fans are creating on Archive of Our Own or other sites where people are imagining beyond what is scripted and taking the TV shows and raw material that they like, but then taking it even further into these queer poly realms that, you know, we'll never see on mainstream television. I'm really impressed by what people can come up with if they have the time and interest.
So we have another shorter question here. What are examples of masculinity / masculine performance in real world or literary world that are not in opposition to the feminine?
That is a great question. And I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to show the Duran clip at the end is because I think some of the people who are coming up now in entertainment are bucking some trends and creating more space for themselves that doesn't attend to these tropes in the same way, which isn't to say that, you know, in another video or even the video that I showed you that Durand is necessarily doing that all the time or successfully. I do think that our ideas of what is possible get expanded when we have more room to experiment and try. And I do see the web being a space where that freedom of possibility is more alive than in traditional media forms and platforms. So I would suggest that we look to what people are creating on TikTok, what people are creating on, you know, YouTube web shows for where we might find some of these ideas of masculinity that go into different spaces and organizing. I'm thinking of the organization being the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective does a lot of work around masculinity and what might be possible through creating another narrative, giving people the opportunity to see beyond what is generally prescribed as an appropriate or correct way to imagine gender.
So I'll wait. So if others want to, I don't think there might be other questions in the chat. I don't see any right now, but while we're waiting for other questions to come on the chat, I have a question. I mean, I was really struck by something you said earlier about that, you know, certain kinds of performances, right? You know, they're okay. Certain kinds of performances that might seem to, right, you know, trouble or kind of disrupt, right, kind of gender conventions. As long as they stay in a particular kind of place, they're fine, right? But once they're out of that place, right, then there's a problem. So I'm thinking, and again, if this doesn't go anywhere, it's fine, because I think it's tangential to what I'm thinking, for instance, of like somebody like Young Thug, right? Who I've been trying to think about for a while. I've been actually thinking about the figure of the diva, the male diva, like kind of,
yeah,
right? So, but I've been thinking about Young Thug, and there's one, he's on Sway in the Morning, and this is maybe 5-6 years ago. It's an interview. And, you know, he's asking them, he's like, you know, you wear dresses, you seem very comfortable wearing, right, you know, traditional women's clothing. He says, well, you know, I hang around a lot of women, so so I was just like, oh, wow, right, there's something here that's interesting. But then right away he says, right, well, he said, I hang around a lot of Coke bottles, is what he said, right? So in the moment, he's right, I mean, obviously, right, you know, likening, you know, a kind of, you know, fantasy of the woman's body to a Coke bottle, to a commodity, but also acknowledging a kind of imitation, a kind of mimesis, right? A kind of a sense in which right? And so anyway, so it's this moment, so in my class, at least, I'm trying to like think about all of the tensions all the kinds. I mean, I'm not optimistic about this being a moment of like subversion or something like that, but it's at least a moment, a fleeting moment of tension. And I'm just wondering, it seems to me in your work, right? I mean, I guess the question I'm asking is a general question about, is it important to be attentive to, even though those moments are always being appropriated or always kind of, you know, you know, yeah, I mean, it seems to me always kind of finding their way back to a kind of, right, cis heteronormative kind of framework. I mean, how do we try to take those fleeting moments, right? Even if it's just pausing the video in class and like just looking at, how do we take those fleeting moments and maybe, right, try to at least think tension before we can even think possibility?
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I do think that's what I was trying to do with like, this little moment at the top of this Genius interview where like this is a space for free. And I'm like, really? But then, I don't open doors for no horse, comes later. So the moment is important, but the moment is not more important than the things that end up recommitting it to the status quo. Like, I do think that noting the moments or the possible cracks in the armor are important, but that's also the power of curiarchy, is that it just finds another way to solidify itself again. It all comes back. And I do think that we should pay attention to that too. How do we keep that space open? And I think that requires more on our part than, I think it requires a collaborative effort. And it's also, the onus isn't just on us as the observers, but also on the person who has potentially opened that space to go further. And that's the part that we have no control over. Like, you can't push someone into a more transformative space than they're ready to be in. But being attentive to the places where there are ruptures gives us the possibility to perhaps put more energy and force in that direction.
So this is thinking through another context, actually. I'm not really an Americanist, I'm a South Africanist. Most of my work is in South Africa. But I was just, as you were talking just now, and then more broadly in the main body of the talk, you just said a few minutes ago, there are spaces and places, maybe mediums, in which certain things are permissible, and then you step out of those bounds and it's no longer really a safe thing to be doing, and it's not permissible. And then in the body of your talk, you spoke about gender and sex as possibly leading to political freedom or to a politics. And so I'm struck by two things. One is the taking up of your work in South Africa. Very interesting. Partly in the context of the student movements and certain forms of leadership that have emerged out of those movements, which is to say, in the first instance, primarily Black women, some of them Black queer women. And because of the history of unfreedoms, right, in that context, not unlike in the US context, those forms of leadership, those people in leadership, are very quickly set aside by a very patriarchal Black patriarchal, misogynistic form of leadership. And there is a sense in which South Africa understands itself as being currently sort of world capital for gender-based violence, gender-based violence, particularly against Black queer women and so on. And so there's this sort of space of where you can do these things and where you can't, right? And a lot of conversation about South Africa being a rape capital of the world and so on, and about corrective rape, right? To align people's sexual orientations in ways that are understood as being appropriate. But then at the same time, and this goes back to your point about you can find spaces in which certain things become permissible. I'm thinking of this incredible duo. I guess you would call them hip hop artists. I'm not quite sure actually what the musical form is, called Faka.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you're familiar with them. But,
I'm not.
Well, I guess I could screen share for a minute and see if I
Yes, please.
But they are really something, and maybe I could find, well, I can find an image first and then perhaps something to, oopsie, we don't want that. There we go. Here they are.
Uh-huh.
And they are now the soundtrack to people like Ralph Lauren on the catwalk. And anyway, my point being that, you know, I'm thinking through my own sort of cultural context and the place where I do my research to recognize more fully this point about where things are permissible within a certain kind of space, a certain kind of medium, in this instance, a musical form, and then the context in which actually the exact opposite is true, which is that this South African society is an incredibly dangerous place for space to be doing things that are liberatory, but not aligned with a whole history of gender policing, of sexual policing, and so on. So while you reflect on that, I'm going to see if I can find one of their tracks, and maybe we can play it if we have time.
Sure. You know, this makes me think of Jackie Alexander's work and pedagogies of crossing, and just that, you know, a place in the Caribbean can be a really untenable space for queer people, queer Black people from their islands, but then a playground for white queers from abroad to enjoy and celebrate and participate in the tourist economy of those spaces. And, you know, that's immediately what came to mind when you were talking about, you know, this music being on the runway, but then, you know, not being safe for queer people on the ground in South Africa. And to me, that again is tied to your earlier comment about what is happening in relationship to people's coming out narratives. You know, that there is still a fraught relationship between sexuality and the identity that gets embodied or accompanies the way we think of sexuality now. And one of the things I like about where Gloria Vlecker's work and also Octavia Butler's work takes us is to thinking about sexuality and gender, not as identities, but as behaviors and roles, and that, you know, opens up something else for us that might be useful in terms of how we move forward. Because the identity, the accruing of a I don't know, political functioning citizenship is very much tied to like a capitalist impulse of how can we monetize your existence? And oh, so you want to partner with this kind of person? Well, that works. You still have to get, you know, your house, your individual house, your individual car, etc. We can operate if this works in that way. But if our kinship is not tied to who we're sleeping with, how we identify, if we demand more for ourselves as people and not as identities, I do think that that does a different kind of work in shifting and shaking the ground, shaking the table of what is expected, and perhaps gets us closer to a different way of imagining our worlds and how we want to be in it.
So I can show a little clip if you would like.
I love it.
And the funny thing is that these, you know, these performers, they sort of shot into the stratosphere of visibility by doing Runway, being soundtrack for Runway, but this first video that I think a lot of us became familiar with is actually weirdly located. It's shot on location in places that normally would be read as unsafe because they're in what's called the location, the ghetto, right? And this one song is about sort of early teen queer romance, things that would not be permitted in the kind of home space. I'll just play a very, very short piece of it, but here we go. Yeah, so it's okay. So what's striking to me about that is the background, like the railway line is there, the township is right there, people walking in the distance. This is precisely the place that would not be safe at all. You know?
Right, right. And that also makes me think too about what becomes permissible if it's permitted at a certain level or by a certain group of people. You know, I'm thinking about just the shift in the story of Caster Semenya in terms of how initially the conversation about her gender was about proving and making sure we understood that she was a regular girl, that she was very much understood in a narrative of traditional femininity, to the point where, you know, she had this makeover where people wanted to assert this about her. But now we have a different narrative that is possible because she is winning and standing in her own truth, and, you know, has a wife and is very clear about her queerness, and that affords a different way of interacting with her that isn't, it's almost like she has taken the narrative back from people who previously, and I think as the example provides, in other contexts, it would be those exact communities that might be a source of violence for her, but are now supporting her because of perhaps an international stage that requires something else of the people who support her.
So fortunately, we are up. we are about at the time here. It's about 6 o'clock. So first, I want to thank you so much, Professor Bailey. This has been amazing. Looking forward to the conversation tomorrow in the hip hop class. But this has been I've always learned a lot from your work, and I've learned so much from this. So thank you so much for participating in our lecture.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Learned a great deal. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Take care.
Thanks to our audience too.
Yeah, thank you, audience. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody and all the great questions. Thank you.